Oh no, no, mon ami! Time to discuss la Marine Nationale! Sorry everyone, to start the video, we're going to look at a series of pictures, and I'm warning you ahead of time, the photos may induce vomiting. Yes, in today's video, we'll be covering some of the ugliest, and quite frankly the worst class of ships to ever grace this planet. France's fleet of samples. Now, it's not because they're French, well, maybe a little bit, but these late 19th century pre-dreadnoughts are truly some of the weirdest, worst, and downright ugly ships out there. Just take Carnot for example. Due to her design, she had stability issues, had difficulty steaming in poor weather, could barely fire her main battery without shaking herself apart due to her shoddy craftsmanship. After years in service in 1908, it was found that rivets of the turret and other structures were either loose and others were missing entirely. So in today's video, with the help of my friends Flotte and History of Everything, we're looking at Charles Martel, Carnot, Jaureguiberry, Masséna, and Bouvet. I think some background is in order, where we have to go back quite a bit. Not that far back, buddy. Back to before 1875. Following the collapse of the Second Empire and the defeat of the French armies in the Franco-Prussian War, the Navy, although remaining mostly intact following the defeat, faced new priorities and restrictions from the East. In this, the Navy took somewhat of a backseat to what it had been in the Second Empire, as Napoleon III was quite the ambitious man and naval planner, attempting to match the Royal Navy and his uncle, not doing either though. Following his fall from power and the rise of the Third Republic, the Navy took major budget cuts to focus on rebuilding the nation and army. For example, in 1872, the French army received 450 million francs, while the Navy received just 145 million francs. Or to quote from French Fleet Ships, Strategy and Operations, 1870 to 1918 by Ruggero Staglini and Michel Constantino, in the first half of the 1870s, the French Navy was forced to downsize its ambitions and consequently focused on two objectives: maintaining control of the Western Mediterranean, a vital task to ensure connections with Algeria, whose occupation had been completed in 1847 and would remain a critical factor in French naval planning over the coming decades, and ensuring the protection of its bases and coasts. There were further developing threats in the Mediterranean with the unification of Italy and the threat of the newly organized Regia Marina would pose, in addition to new possessions like Tunisia, leading to some changes in the policy. With that in mind, France built coastal defense ships, more seagoing battleships, and of course Auch, the floating hotel. We'll talk about her more next week, but man, she was a bad ship. In the late 1880s, battleship construction had been suspended and then resumed, with the powers at be favoring the Jaureguiberry fleet composition that focused on smaller craft, were to take from Stephen S. Roberts and French warships in the Age of Steam, 1859 to 1914. During the 1880s and 1890s, all navies had to adjust to fundamental technological challenges, above all the torpedo. In France, the adjustments involved heated polemics in the press and parliament by partisans of the Jaureguiberry, literally young school, favoring torpedo boats as a replacement for the mastodontes, mastodon battleships. While much of the Navy and its civilian supporters defended battleships as the only lasting form of sea power. With this in mind, on January 7, 1886, Rear Admiral Bouvet, the leader of the Jaureguiberry that advocated for, among other things, building torpedo boats in place of battleships, became Minister of Marine. Now, he lasted until May of 1887, and for the sake of time, without delving too deep into it, battleship construction was continued under a new minister. French politics never ceased to amaze me with all the shuffling of the ministers. Along with that, in February 1887, with the renewal of the Triple Alliance between Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, there were calls for a stronger navy, and thus a rather ambitious naval building program that was to come to be in 1890, which included the building of battleships. Leading us to the construction of our wonderful ships, where I think I'd like to quote from Staglini and Constantino again when they write, The 5 ships were built in 5 different dockyards/arsenals and shipyards, where the relevant construction managers introduced their significant modifications. Charles Martel, Carnot, and Jaureguiberry were laid down in 1891. Masséna followed in September 1892, and Bouvet in early 1893. Since the design modifications introduced by the dockyards/shipyards were related to hull and superstructure, it is difficult to understand fully their logic. The only effective need being to avoid overloading and overcome stability issues. Taking into account the final result, it is safe to assume that these objectives were not reached. The 5 ships had in common only a tumble-home hull shape and the layout of the main caliber guns, arranged in 4 single turrets, of which 2 were placed along the centerline of the ship and 2 athwart ships on sponsons. This disposition would allow both broadside and forward fire, even though a trend of the time was going towards line-ahead formations of capital ships that emphasized broadside fire. With that, the construction of battleships was back on. Their arch-rival in the Royal Navy building newer and better battleships, the Marine Nationale felt it was important to respond, along with emerging threats in the Mediterranean, such as the newly formed Italian Regia Marina. And genuinely, the Italian Navy was a serious threat. I know there are a lot of memes out there about Italian arms, but the Regia Marina was good, I swear, guys. With that, there were good reasons to build a new class of battleships. They just so happened to go about it in an interesting way. To take from John Jordan and Philippe Cresse in French battleships of World War I, the French program, for which initial discussions took place during late 1889, could be more accurately described as a vanity project. Competing design proposals were invited for the new ships for consideration for the Council of Works. In the equivalent of an academic essay contest, the prize being the commission of a ship from each of the 4 winners. Certain key parameters were set for displacement, armament, and the thickness of the armor on the belt and turrets. Still, otherwise, complete latitude was accorded to the designer, who could decide the overall dimensions, the hull form, and silhouette, the disposition of the medium guns, the power and layout of the propulsion machinery, and the system of protection, including compartmentalization. It was an ambitious project aimed to massage the egos of the various eminent naval architects of the period, many of whom were closely associated with a particular naval dockyard or private shipyard. So not exactly the most traditional way of designing ships. And with the aforementioned freedoms given to the various dockyards and designers, things were going to get interesting. And what I mean by interesting, I really mean terrible.
Hello everyone, I'm Svalada and I have been summoned to talk about French ships. A bit of a different subject than I normally cover, but what the hell, I'll give it a go. Well, we're actually talking about French ships, not friendships. If you look at tanks, especially from the First World War and the interwar period, you see some very questionable designs. Because at that time nobody really knew what a tank was supposed to do. So you end up with things like the Sire tank, which is, that sure is a thing. Now, this problem didn't just exist on land, it also existed on the sea as well. For battleships, it wasn't until HMS Dreadnought showed up that everyone went, "Write that down, write that down!" However, the Jaureguiberry and the other ships in this video were pre-dreadnought battleships, so just like the Tsar tank, you get something that is, interesting. So, just like Charles Margaux and Carnot, the Jaureguiberry was a response to the British Royal Navy passing the Naval Defence Act. All the battleships that will be covered in this video had different designs, but meeting the same basic requirements, including armor, armament and displacement. For the Jaureguiberry, it was decided that she should not exceed 14,000 metric tons, the main battery should be a 34 cm and a 27 cm gun, and the ship should maintain a top speed of 17 knots. Or 31 kilometers an hour. For a secondary armament, they could use a 14 cm or a 16 cm caliber gun, with, quote, as many guns fitted as space would allow. Now, 5 naval architects submitted proposals for the ship, with Embarked again winning the competition. The design was heavily based on earlier French battleships, especially the French battleship Brilliance. Jaureguiberry also used a very similar hull form as Marceau. These two ships were shorter and wider than the other ships in this video. Another big difference in comparison to the other ships in this video was the gun layout. Instead of putting all the main guns in the center line, the Jaureguiberry would mount some of its bigger guns on the side of the ship. In theory, this would give better firing angles. She was also going to be the first French battleship that was going to use electric motors to turn her guns. And all in all, this ship had some pretty forward-thinking ideas and designs for the time. Anyway, she was laid down on the 23rd of April 1891, and even though the French wanted a 34cm and 27cm gun on the ship, she ended up with a slightly smaller main gun, with a 305mm main gun, along with slightly bigger 274mm guns mounted on the side of the ship. She was launched on the 27th of October 1893, and overall, well, like the rest of the ships in this video, she wasn't exactly perfect.
You're not perfect.
She suffered from stability issues and an awkward layout of the guns. Again, this was pre-dreadnought, so these kind of things were kind of to be expected. However, what probably nobody expected was the incredible amount of bad luck that this ship would have throughout her service life. She was complete enough to begin her sea trials in 1896, but during a 24-hour engine trial, a tube in one of her boilers bursted, killing 6 and wounding 30. Okay, that is not really a good start, but surely things will go better moving forward. 2 months later, she suffered from another accident testing her main guns. Details on this second incident are a little bit unclear, but it is safe to say that that is a pretty rough start for the ship. Well, surely things will go better moving forward. The next year, just after she was commissioned into the fleet, an explosion occurred in the torpedo air chamber. So okay, after those little incidents, things went pretty good for the ship, at least for a while. She took part in training exercises, fleet maneuvers, and doing all kinds of ship things. However, this streak of good luck couldn't last long, because in 1902 another explosion occurred, again in the torpedo air chamber.
It is even funnier the second time.
And bad luck kept following her. In 1904 she managed to hit a rock while entering a harbor under heavy fog. Nothing catastrophic, but let's just move on. Anyway, comedy comes in threes, so the next year another torpedo explosion. And yeah, you can guess it. Again, in the torpedo air chamber. This time it was so severe that it flooded part of her steering system. Oh, and around the same time she also ran aground while visiting Britain. After that she returned to the Mediterranean squadron. And in 1907, after this long and distinctive service life, she was assigned to a reserve division, which is probably a good idea. This thing's torpedoes were a bigger danger to French sailors than any British ship, so throwing her in reserve was probably the best move. One of the more noteworthy things that she did during the pre-war period was to help with testing early firing control system technology that would later be used on more useful battleships. Now, when World War I broke out, you might expect this ship to just sit this one out, seeming this ship's service history and it already being outdated. But surprisingly, the French fleet actually mobilized Jaureguiberry and sent her to North Africa, helping to escort troop convoys throughout the Mediterranean. The French needed to move thousands of troops quickly, and losing these convoys would be disastrous. So even older ships like the Jaureguiberry all of a sudden had a job again, unlike you watching this video. Anyway, she was also part of the force that was meant to counter the German battlecruiser SMS Goeben, which turned into a bit of a nothing burger, seeing that Goeben already escaped to the Ottoman Empire. The most important part of her wartime career would be in 1915 at the Dardanelles. After earlier attacks went a bit worse than expected for the French, reinforcements were desperately needed, so Jaureguiberry was sent in. And this is where she actually did something. She bombed enemy positions and supported troops during their landings. During the landing of Cape Ellis, she helped by suppressing Ottoman defenses, firing on coastal guns to protect the Allied troops that were coming ashore. She even took a few hits from Ottoman artillery, but miraculously she survived this with even very little damage to the vessel. By 1916 she also helped with defending the Suez Canal, and that was basically it for the ship. At that point she wasn't very useful anymore, with some of her guns even being removed to be used on land. After the war she was decommissioned and briefly used as a trading ship, before finally being sold for scrap in 1934. Anyway, that is all for this ship. I'm very sorry for my French pronunciations, and I'm just gonna fade into the void.
To start off with, we have the Charles Martel, and I just want to thank Important Naval History for having me on for this collaboration. The Charles Martel was, shockingly, named for, well, Charles the Hammer Martel. Martel is one of those major heroes from French history and was famous for the Battle of Tours in 732 AD, which arguably was the battle that ensured France was not conquered by the Islamic Caliphate based in Spain. The design of Charles Martel was effectively the same as Carnot, which is a crime against the eyes, and I will get to her momentarily. Anyway, taking from Roberts, on July 4th, 1890, Director of Material B&M reported to Minister Bouvet that the Works Council of June 12th, 1890 had identified Huin's 13,273-ton design, the one by Seglier, as suitable for further work. But once the council's suggestions were incorporated, the displacement would approach 14,000 tons. On the other hand, the council, reflecting the view of many flag officers, formally rejected the armament of 4 274.4mm guns as inadequate, and wanted greater penetration power for 2 guns of the new battleships. After some debates between 340 and 305mm guns, they chose the new 305 45 caliber gun. As it goes with French designs though, there were debates about the smaller caliber guns, armour, and so forth. Generally normal stuff. Thus, Charles Martel was laid down on August 1st, 1891, and then the belt armour was ordered in 4 lots, 1 of hammered steel from Schneider and 3 of compound metal from Morel Ferrès, Saint-Chamond, and Chatillon at Commentary. About 2/3 of the belt was compound and 1/3 steel, and this was the first use of nickel steel in belt armour in France. It was pretty innovative. But, as with all ships of this class, Charles Martel, you'll be shocked to hear, ran into some issues while being built. See, early as August 1891, when she was laid down, there were serious concerns about the ship being overweight, which takes some reworking, and by 1893, they had worked out that the superstructure needed to be redesigned and modified to reduce its weight. And to reduce the target it was going to provide to enemy high explosive, but that's a whole other point. 2 small redoubts placed under the longitudinal bridge, one forward and one aft, whose purpose was to accommodate a single 47mm gun, were suppressed. The guns being relocated, and the Admiral's smoking gallery was removed as well, to be replaced in its function by the deck after the Admiral's cabin on either side of the 305mm turret. The flare locker was also moved, the flares being stowed elsewhere, with the superstructure under the longitudinal bridge, the flying deck, being eliminated as well. The bridge was lowered to 4 metres above the deck, and the conning tower was also lowered. The foremast was reduced in height to match the aftermast, and breast plans for the ship, where it was being built, because remember, each individual dockyard could alter the design of the battleship as much as they wanted, provided they hit the basic design features. Well, they suppressed the aft-firing torpedo tubes that they planned for their battleship. By December 1895, they'd done it. The reserve tonnage was well under what they needed, and well... Now, normally I would go over the characteristics of a ship here, talking shop and going over what was important. Instead, I'll just put up a photo of the information for your viewing pleasure, and I'll leave it up for 5 seconds or so. You can pause it and, watch it, then get back to the rest of the video. Now, she would serve in various capacities and eventually decommissioned in January 1914, becoming a hulk where her various guns and internals were used for the war effort in some odd capacities. She was old, outdated, and quite frankly, crap. So to sum it up, just some of the problems: she was overweight, stability issues, couldn't fire her main battery correctly, wasn't actually missing any parts unlike Carnot, but in general, she was just a bad ship. To dig into it a bit more real quick, the ship was overweight and top-heavy, tumble home, shocking, leading to stability issues, something that all ships in the fleet of samples suffered from, which led to poor sea keeping and a very bad tendency to just roll, when waves hit it, which, at sea, chance in a million. Anyway, her gun layout was crap too, making it difficult for fire control situations, which added to the stability problems. And, there's one other thing from Staglini and Casento that sums this up quite well. Although built more rapidly than the pre-dreadnoughts completed in the previous decade, Charles Martel, Carnot, Jaureguiberry, Masséna, and Bouvet spent a long time on the slipways. The first 3 were completed by 1897, and the last 2 followed in June 1898. The French procedure for ordering a new construction was so convoluted that men of war, especially battleships, took far longer to complete than all major surface warships built by other European naval powers. Additionally, lack of funds hampered placing orders for more than 1 ship per year, a limitation that resulted in construction times being forced to be longer and rearrangements for other issues and other rearrangements of the original common design, in accordance to initiatives taken by individual shipyards and dockyards. Next, we have the Carnot, or Laissez Carnot. I'd just call it the Carnot. It's named for a figure of the French Revolution. The design of Carnot was effectively the same as Charles Martel, although the final designs were subject to changes from the Works Council, a subcommittee of the French General Naval Staff. You know, the council that asked for the removal of the shelters overhanging the main batteries and stuff, and removed everything on the Charles Martel. Similar kind of concept here. A distinctive feature of the design was the fact that the upper works were set well back from the curved hull sides to produce a steady gun platform, something similar to another ship we've already talked about, Masséna. You just gotta love the tumble home design, you really do. The ship was to be built in Toulon and in typical French fashion and design of the period. Again, each shipyard subject to change the design where they saw fit, so long as they met the basic requirements. So the engines, guns, funnels, and all sorts of stuff, well, again, characteristics up on screen now for you to look at. Carnot entered service in 1897 and was certainly an interesting looking ship with a large number of portholes that were eventually filled due to the risk of flooding. I did a video on this ship myself on my channel, and the less I have to look at it in the future, the better. I don't know why I agreed to look at this again, but you know, sub to important naval history, he deserves it for looking at these things. Anyway, static machinery trials were completed on January 3rd, 1896, but underway trials were delayed until the hull was ready. It then became clear that the ship was overweight. Shocking. And of questionable stability. Shocking. The solution was then to cut down the bridge work and military masts, along with the foremast being lightened and the after-military mast being removed altogether and replaced with a pole. The designed light armament of 4 65mm quick-firing guns on the fore and aft superstructures, 8 47mm guns on the main bridge and in the tops, and 8 37mm revolving cannons was also altered upon commissioning. We're going like to 5 levels of different battery here, and you wonder why these things weren't the most accurate. The ship was originally fit with facilities for an admiral, as she was thought to be going to be a flagship. Still, those were directed to be removed shortly after, and interestingly enough, once the observation post around the base of the foremast was removed, the ship actually started steering significantly better. That being removed in 1905. During gunnery trials after a decade in service, it was found that the excessive motion of the recoil was noted in the forward 305mm turret, and this was traced actually to a weakness in the foundation of the lower part of the ship. Further examination and repairs in 1908 showed that the rivets of the turret and other structures were loose, and others were just missing entirely, having pinged off when the ship was firing. Repairs were completed in 1909, and the ship was laid up and scrapped finally in 1922. She was old, outdated, and quite frankly, a bad ship. So, to give you some of the problems here, again, overweight, stability issues, couldn't fire its guns properly, and just had bits missing.
Oh no, no, mon ami, is that a baguette in your pocket, or are you just happy to see me? Sorry about that, guys. I really don't know what that's about, but our next ship is Masséna, named for one of Napoleon Bonaparte's marshals. Like the rest of these ships, certainly an ambitious name. The French at least know how to name things. A new minister of the Marine, Minister Bouvet, loved the politics, on January 28, 1891, called for plans for 2 battleships of the 1892 budget. One submission came from here, I'll put it up on screen now. Maria and Louis Debussy, not that one, or that one, you sick perverts, joined the firm as a consultant, effectively after retiring as Inspector General in 1889. He felt that low freeboard hulls with rounded sides, like Férieux and J'aimais pas, could both save weight and provide a stable gun platform, and in Masséna, he combined this type of hull with a tall, narrow superstructure on the center line supporting guns and other fittings needed for a first-class battleship. Carnot had a similar layout. He extended the low hull with a long ram-shaped inverted bow, although the council made him moderate it. He also favored vaulted sterns that were hollowed out above the screw in his previous designs. The coastal defense battleships, giving Masséna one also. A.C. Leroy wanted to try triple screws, an interesting design choice as they were unproven. To be fair, all these decisions were interesting choices. Still, it was accepted by the government, asking that the design changes included additional armor and 100mm quick-firing guns. Work commenced on the battleship in late 1892. Keel laying coming somewhat later. During the construction, Schneider asked to modify the 305mm and 274.4mm turret designs. The steel armor for the belt and the turrets and the rig was also altered. Here are the particulars. Interestingly enough, on her trials, Masséna, with the 3 screws in a vaulted stern, the singular rudder, after being enlarged during trials, struggled to maneuver the ship. The vaulted stern also pounded badly in rough weather. French ships with more conventional hull shapes and triple screws did not encounter these problems. So another strike for the tumble-home hull design. Another little bit about her machinery comes from Staglini and Constantino. In Masséna, there were 2 forward boiler rooms, which were surrounded by coal bunkers, a magazine, another boiler room, and 3 engine rooms. Each boiler room housed 8 boilers, while each engine room was a self-contained compartment with transverse and longitudinal watertight bulkheads. Now, each of the ships that were built in this period spent a significant amount of time on the stocks, being completed in 1897 and 1898. Masséna remained on active duty until 1913, when she was sent out of service, reduced to a hulk in 1915, and too old for participation in war missions. Masséna was towed from Toulon to Cape Helles on the Gallipoli Peninsula by November 1915 and scuttled to form a breakwater, protecting the evacuation of Allied expeditionary forces. At least she did something good in the end. Bouvet, named for a French admiral of the 18th and 19th centuries, in early 1891, before even the keel had been laid down for Charles Martel, Charles Huon, who had designed her, had submitted another design for an improved version, the basis of Bouvet. She was to be slightly larger than her 4 half-sisters and incorporate new features, being the only one by 1914 in frontline service. Pretty good, right? Well, we'll get into the problem shortly. She was to be built in Lorient Naval Dockyard. She was to be laid down in January of 1893, where she had some interesting features. Taking from Jordan Caresse again. As designed, Bouvet had a length between perpendiculars of almost 118 meters and a displacement of 12,200 tons. The hull was not cut down aft, superstructures amidships were reduced in height, and there was to be 2 relatively short military masts. However, the hull had the same pronounced tumble home as the earlier ships to maximize fore and aft arcs for the wing turrets. The armament followed along similar lines to the other ships, 305mm and 274mm guns with a smattering of other ones. Now here's a picture of the particulars for your viewing pleasure. Like the other ships of this interesting class, Bouvet had stability issues. An 1894 model was used to reveal how vulnerable the ship was if the cofferdam of the ship was breached. The free flow of water above the armored deck would have created similar problems experienced by the modern car ferry Herald of Free Enterprise, causing the ship to capsize. At the same time, concerns were expressed about the piecemeal increases in weight, particularly about the armor plates and turrets. Lorient was invited to suggest weight-saving measures, but Huon, who was unable to supervise the ship's construction due to his other commitments, resisted any departure from the plans. He in turn proposed weight-saving measures, including the replacement of the military mast by a pole mast, reduction in the thickness of plating, and lighter anchors in the pattern of Brennus. To sum up the problems, she was overweight, had stability issues, had problems firing her main battery, and thankfully no missing parts, unlike Carnot. Another reason why she had problems was that her turrets weren't balanced. It was estimated that training them on the broadside would result in a 2-degree angle of heel. The half-meter height of the belt meant that at normal load, it would be submerged with an angle of 3 degrees, which left a very small margin for sea conditions and how overweight she was. The fat-shaming of these ships will continue because being overweight like they are causes a lot of issues. But a lot of them were resolved in the coming years through refits, like the lightening of the superstructure and the deletion of the 37mm Hotchkiss guns. Those tests to her stability prove fortuitous, and are another reason why she's a bad ship. During the First World War, Bouvet was participating in the Dardanelles campaign, where she was to provide gunfire support to Allied troops and maybe even force their way through the straits to Constantinople. However, she was certainly the most unlucky of the fleet of samples, as during the campaign, she suffered several hits from Turkish forts, and on March 18, 1915, she struck a mine which exploded below the starboard 274mm gun. Bouvet capsized in 2 minutes, taking 660 officers and men down with her. As the model showed from earlier, she did capsize and roll over quickly. To dig into her problems a bit more, really quick, the ship was overweight and top-heavy, leading to stability issues, something all ships in the fleet of samples suffered from. It led to poor seakeeping and a dangerous tendency to roll, and her gun layout wasn't the best, making for difficult fire control, which added to the stability issues. To open this last part up, I want to take from Constantino and Staglini again. Although built more rapidly than the pre-dreadnoughts completed in the previous decade, Charles Martel, Carnot, Jaureguiberry, Masséna, and Bouvet spent a long time on the slipways. The first 3 were completed by 1897, and the last 2 followed in June 1898. The French procedure for ordering new construction was so convoluted that men of war, especially battleships, took far longer to complete than almost all major warships built by other European naval powers. Additionally, lack of funds hampered placing orders for more than one ship per year, a limitation that resulted in longer construction times, forced rearrangement of the original common design in accordance to the initiatives taken by individual shipyards and dockyards. There were a lot of things wrong with the fleet of samples, and I think it comes down to 3 broad ideas to why the fleet of samples was so bad. 1. A flawed system of construction for the ships. 2. Overweight, top-heavy designs with chronic stability issues. And 3. Poor construction quality. Starting off with that first point, that quote from Jordan Caresse really illustrates that issue. The French program for which the initial discussions took place during late 1889 could be more accurately described as a vanity project. Competing design proposals were invited for the new ships for consideration for the Council of Works. In the equivalent of an academic essay contest, the prize being the commission of a warship from each of the 4 winners. Certain key parameters were set for displacement, armament, and the thickness of the armor on the belt and turrets. Still, otherwise, complete latitude was accorded to the designer, who could decide the overall dimensions, the hull form and silhouette, the disposition of the medium guns, the power and layout of the propulsion machinery, and the system of protection, including compartmentalization. It was an ambitious project aimed to massage the egos of the various eminent naval architects of the period, many of whom were closely associated with a particular naval dockyard or private shipyard. The way going about the designing of the ships was so hodgepodge and almost leaderless, it begs the question how the ships were built in the first place. In that same vein, the way the French Admiralty was at the time, as seen in that quote, just how laissez-faire they were about their designs, and delegating them to individual shipyards, whom really were allowed to do whatever they wanted with some provisions for what the Admiralty desired generally. It's almost like the Soviet Union in the 1930s, except without all the murder and gulag stuff. It's important to note that the French also had difficulty expanding their dockyards properly during this time because of how and where they were built. In the various naval arsenals and dockyards, they were extremely restricted because of how the cities they were located in were built up around them, the French being the French and being quite partial to their architecture and historical consideration, which I do appreciate, didn't want the Navy to go around destroying all the buildings in their way to build up any dockyard so they could build bigger and better designed warships. Why build modern shipbuilding infrastructure when you could have Gaston make a baguette in a local bakery? I'm just kidding. Here's a video by Jaureguiberry that goes far more into depth on this point. The next point about the designs being overweight, top-heavy designs with chronic stability issues is seen in every ship of the class, and honestly comes from one critical failure of their design, amongst many, the tumble-home hulls. When it comes to these fatty fat ships, after issues with Auch and Brennus, French designers went forward with that idea. Despite the warning signs, France doubled down on tumble-home designs with the fleet of samples. The layout theoretically gave good arcs of fire, but it ignored the tactical shift toward line-ahead formations that emphasized broadside firepower. Worse, each ship was overweight, fatty, with high superstructures and poor stability. Carnot, for instance, had her bridge work and military mass reduced, and even then she suffered from steering problems and excessive motion that damaged her forward turret foundations. Charles Martel was overweight almost from the start. forcing constant reductions in her upper works, leaving the ship still top-heavy. Masséna was perhaps the most ungainly of the lot, with her vaulted stern, triple screws, and ram bow that made her hard to maneuver and unpleasant in rough seas. Collectively, these ships were slow to build, late to commission, and obsolete almost as soon as they entered service. The French themselves admitted that the objectives of avoiding overloading and resolving stability problems had simply not been met. Not to mention the ships were poor gun platforms in some cases, like Carnot. Speaking of Carnot, she really is the poster child of poor build quality. Having parts such as rivets missing from the build is quite frankly criminal. Omitting details like that could have led to disaster, and thankfully for the crew, it didn't happen. Hopefully whoever was responsible was apprehended by the gendarmerie whilst twirling a handlebar mustache. Anyway, the rest of the ships weren't much better. For Charles Martel, as early as August 1891, there were serious concerns that she was overweight, forcing reworks, which included lowering the bridge and conning tower, reducing the foremast, and suppressing entire features like redoubts and the Admiral's smoking gallery, and even aft-firing torpedo tubes. I mean, we could go on and on about this point, but by this point, you all know that these ships are terrible. It's incroyable. Sorry. It's been fun butchering the French language throughout the video, but it's just fascinating how terrible these ships were. These French ships are some of the oddest, ugliest, and worst vessels to ever sail, but there's a spot in my heart for them. A rather large and inflamed spot in my heart because of how fat they are. But they show how technology and ideas develop as the Marine Nationale went from building these disgusting, hideous, obese, vile, horrendous, revolting, nauseating, foul, deplorable, heinous vessels to the Richelieu class in an extremely short period of time, at least in terms of the history of the world. I would be remiss if I didn't say that, yes, these ships had some good qualities, particularly with their armor and machinery, showing how the Marine Nationale developed in the 20th century. Thank you so much to History of Everything and Zwalada for help on the video. Anyway, remember to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.
Don't forget about me, mon ami. I'll be back.